everybody. It is truly my pleasure to be with you. And I enjoy getting to come to these different webinars. It's been a real gift, if you will, to be able to have some of these virtual events. Because in the past year, I have been able to meet more people than I could have ever met in probably a 7 to 10 year period. I've had the chance to interact with people with really different ideas and diversity and opportunities to serve, and I just love that and love connecting with people. So that's really my heart's desire, is to kind of have that opportunity to interact with people. As Bill said, we met at a ACA visit in Nashville and we had a really good time. And if you learn anything about me, you'll learn that I'm a big cut up and I love to laugh. I get that from my grandmother. She has a very robust kind of deep laugh. And so people always say, you can always find Tracey, because I'm definitely not a quiet chicken. So I'm going to share with you today a little bit about Camp Health Services. We have learned so much over the past year. And before we started, I said to the guys I was speaking with, I said, what we were saying in May last year or March or April, we are now saying, wait a minute, we need to tweak that a little bit. It's different now. And so over the past year, we've had a unique opportunity to do some robust research around these areas of camp and really camping in COVID times, right? So we did quantitative survey work to both camp's healthcare staff, camp directors. We did qualitative work where I interviewed camps very intensely around what they did last summer. And then we looked at over 8,000 health log entries at summer camps that operated last summer. We wanted to look and see what were those people documenting at camp, to give us an idea of kind of what the flavor was of people rolling into the health center, right? Was there a lot of illness? What were they treating throughout the summer? And really found some really interesting findings. And I'm going to share some of that research with you today. I'm going to talk about current recommendations and really hopefully kind of start steering us toward planning for summer 2021. So I'm going to talk about what was done last summer, what really worked well. And when we talk about things that worked well, many things that camps did last summer, especially in the interview process, they said, that worked so well, we're keeping it. Like forever, Tracey, we're keeping it. And I was like, oh, that is wonderful. So it wasn't just changes to health services, it was changes to many different things. So we really want to kind of highlight some of those as well, and then talk about some current recommendations, where we are right now related to how you manage this communicable disease state called COVID in the camp setting. I love this top picture of these kids with a mask on. And one of the things that came out of last summer that was a beautiful experience was that when we were going into last summer, people said, oh, Tracey, you've lost your mind. There's no way kids are going to wear a mask at camp. There's no way you're going to be able to keep them distanced. There's no way they're going to do all these things you want them to do. And I said, you could be right. You could be right. But what I found is that our youth are resilient. Last summer, the kids were zero problems. Not a single camp that I interviewed said, oh, it was just tough managing the kids. No, they said, hey, kiddo, can you put your mask on? Kids said, no problem. I'm here with my friends where I'm supposed to be at camp. And they said, hey, can you step away from your friends? You're a little close. No problem. I still get to go swimming with my friends, right? So kids have a very different approach to life sometimes than we do as adults. As adults, we have a lot of this thinking back and thinking forward. What we know about our kids is they're very centered on this moment now. There's a beauty to that, right? There's a beauty to thinking like our kids think at camp. And we do that. Most of us, when we get to camp and we shut that gate and the camp closes and we're there for a week or however long, we kind of get really focused on what's going on right then. And I think a huge part of that is because of our children and the populations we serve and the families we serve, because they can get very invested. And we love that. It was a beautiful outcome from the summer last year. So I want to kind of start with this slide right here, because what we're really going to break down for you in this presentation is really the whole concept of a communicable disease plan. And I'm going to call it a CDP because it's a mouthful of words. So a CDP is really the comprehensive umbrella of what camps did last year. And the first part of that CDP was prevention activities. A huge part of the plan is prevention activities. We call those NPIs. either non-pharmacologic or non-pharmaceutical interventions. There were 7 of those we encouraged camps to try to utilize last year, and we'll walk through those. The next piece is supply and resource procurement in your plan, making sure you have adequate supplies for cleaning, supplies for hand washing, and just resources to help bolster and support your population that's there. That could be things like behavioral health support, social workers, ministerial support, people to support whatever the needs might be at your camp. The third piece is outbreak management, and we're going to talk about, this is the one that people go, yes, this is what scares me, Tracey. What if a kid presents with illness at camp? And we're going to walk you through that because it's very manageable and something you can easily do within the context of camp. And then, of course, the fourth piece is communication and debriefing. Communication and debriefing is a really critically important piece, and we don't want to negate that activity, but how we communicate and how we debrief people in events that seem traumatic to them is really an important part of the process as well. So let's launch into some of these and let's start talking about the different pieces. Last summer, we encouraged 7 different NPIs, and they're listed for you here, all right? These NPIs included things like face masking, cohorting, ventilation, and they were all good things that every camp can do. Now, I can't create your prevention plan for you because I don't know your camp. I don't know what your capacity is. I don't know what populations you serve, but I think you can look at these and say, okay, face mask, Tracey, face mask. How do we do that at our camp? Some camps last year had kids bring a face mask for every day. Said, okay, children, bring a cloth face mask for every day. Some camps had campers bring a face mask, 2 or 3 of them, and they washed them at night. Some camps did disposable, just the typical blue disposable face mask, and gave a new one to everybody every day. None of those are a wrong answer. You can do any of that. You just need to decide what might work best within your system. If you don't have access to laundry facilities, then you probably don't want to take up washing mask. But if you do, that's a really easy way to kind of have campers bring 2 or 3 masks and then recycle them for the week or so of camp that you're there together. What we learned from last summer is that the gaiters, they call them gaiters, it's the thing people wear around their neck and they pull it up over their face like this, are really not a good option for face mask. 2 primary reasons. They're single layer, and the recommendation is a double layer material. And they're usually made of a silky type of material, right? Because it's a little lightweight and it's not quite so heavy. But the problem is that silky material sort of projects respiratory secretions further than we even do if we weren't wearing a gaiter. So we're like, the gaiters are not something we're recommending for this year because we're finding that those respiratory secretions tend to come from that silky material a little more robustly than not having a mask at all at times. Ventilation, we didn't know much about ventilation last year. We said, well, it's probably a good idea if you go outdoors, have more space, get people separated. But what we learned is that ventilation last year was critical. And what we learned is that from our qualitative data, every camp that did everything outdoors, they did health services outdoors, they fed people outdoors, they did activities outdoors. And I'm talking about camps in Texas now where it's hot. They had no cases of COVID. No camp that did everything outdoors had any cases of COVID in our interviewed group. And I thought that was very interesting, right? You would think there would be at least 1 or 2 camps. And we're talking about even really suspect cases, right? So they didn't even present with people who presented with illness that we might consider suspect. So we tell people, if you have screens on your cabins, open the windows, open the doors, turn ceiling fans on, take as much as you can outside, do everything you can outside. We've learned that small amount of ambient air movement pushes those heavy respiratory droplets down out of circulation, and it decreases your risk. The other part about being outside is that it causes natural distancing, right? So if you and I go outside and we're going to play a game, it's pretty natural for us to space apart. If we're going to throw a frisbee or throw a football or do some type of relay racing, we're not going to be standing close together for extended periods of time. So we know that the outdoors does create some natural distancing as well. If you're going hiking, you tend to be spaced 6 feet apart. If you're going to be horseback riding, you're 6 feet apart, right? So there's lots of things that help promote that ventilation and outdoors, and also the physical distancing piece. We encouraged physical distancing last year. We knew it would be the hardest thing to do, right? Um, but we know that it did help in the context of keeping people to thinking about staying apart. We knew that it'd be hard because we're all relational, we're all human. We want to pat somebody on the back for a job well done. We want to fist bump each other for a job well done. And we're not saying you have to completely eliminate that, but you just want people to have an awareness of health and wellness of themselves and others. We're going to talk about screening and cohorting more on the next couple slides. Sanitizing was really great as well. Last year we said sanitize everything because we think there's fomites and fomites might transmit COVID. What we know now is that probably fomite transmission is much less than we expected. So last summer camps did two things with sanitizing, frequently and high touch. All right. And that means they'd clean frequently, which was usually daily, and they did high touch areas, which was usually bathrooms, doorknobs, tables. All right. So dining tables, arts and crafts tables, the doorknobs that people touch a lot, and then the bathroom facility is getting cleaned typically at least once a night. We're going to talk about hand hygiene as well. So let me talk about screening. Screening was one of those 7. And last summer we did screening really in a 2 or 3 tier process. Most camps last year, and again, most camps this year, and we're expecting that over 80% of camps will open this summer, probably closer to the 90% mark, will open this summer. The ones that don't are typically, that are still ebbing and flowing, are more of the special needs groups. But pretty much everybody else is planning to open with a robust program. But last year we did screening, kind of a 3-layered experience. Pre-screening was hugely helpful. The goal of pre-screening was to encourage people to develop awareness of their health. We didn't go into last summer thinking that people would say, oh, I'm going to find COVID in pre-screening. That's not at all what we thought. But we did encourage people to do it to raise their health awareness every day. So every day when they got up, we had individuals self-screen, staff and campers. And every day that we get up and ask themselves, do I have a cough? Do I have a fever? Do I have loss of taste and smell? Do I have any of these COVID symptoms? Yes, no, yes, no. And they took their own temperature and they recorded that, right? And they did that for 10 to 14 days before camp last summer. The goal was that they were thinking about it every day, right? So we're going to then, when they arrive to us at the initial screening, we do exactly the same thing. And it's normalized, if you will, for them to go, yeah, no, I don't have any of those things. This morning I feel great. Everything's good. No fever. We take their temperature when they arrive at the initial screening and we can move on. All right. And then there's ongoing screening. Now, if you're a day camp, I don't know how many day camps you guys have or if you have day camps, but if you're a day camp, that initial and ongoing screening kind of collapse into one event, right? Because those campers and staff arrive every day. So you have to screen every day. And so that is initial and ongoing screening is their daily screening process for day camps. At residential camps, in the ongoing part, it was very different about what camps did last year. There was no set parameters around what you did from an ongoing perspective. Some camps took temperatures every day. Okay. Some camps just had staff get up in the morning and say, hey, camper, how are you feeling today? You have any symptoms? You feeling good? Camper says, yeah, I feel great. I'm ready to go to archery, right? And check. The counselor checked off a little check sheet and off they went for their day. Again, raising health awareness. That's what the goal was of screening. So that then if we've asked them for 10 or 14 days before they arrive, we ask them again on arrival. And now it's day 3 at camp and a kiddo gets up and they're coughing. Hello, everybody's aware. Everybody goes, Kiefer, you weren't coughing yesterday and now you are today, right? That alerts us to check that out immediately, right? And so it's really a nice feature to kind of help everybody be on the same page to kind of move response to illness events at a quicker pace than maybe we have historically. What we know by this health awareness and then people arriving to camp in a healthy state is that this summer we had hardly any illness. I said to the camps, I said, how much cough did you have this summer? Camps were like, nobody coughed. Well, how much fever? We had one kid with a low grade temp because he was out in the sun too long. How much GI illness did you have? We didn't have any GI illness. So what we knew, not only was this helping, this health awareness and these NPIs doing good care, it was keeping people healthy, right? We had no flu symptoms, no respiratory symptoms. And the funny part is the healthcare staff at the camp said, we're a little bored. We hired extra staff this year because of COVID, and we kind of sat around and looked at each other. So the beauty of that is that it proved to us over and again that all of these NPIs were working as long as we were doing them collaboratively together. Cohorting, let's talk about that. The most consistent thing that was done last year was cohorting, meaning keeping people in small groups. So let's say you operate a camp of about 100 people, 100 campers come. You might have them in 10 groups of 10 and have a couple counselors with that group of 10. And I'm making those numbers up, of course. But then that group travels the camp together as a unit. They can still do all the activities. They can still engage and play, but they typically did not intermix with the other groups. They did not call themselves cohorts because it's just an unusual word. Kids can't say it anyway. So they call themselves villages and families and pods and gave themselves all kinds of names. But they kind of had fun with it. They said, this is our family. This is how we're going to have this wonderful summer camp experience with over the next 5, 7, 10 days, whatever that might be. Initially, we got some pushback because some camps said that just changes our culture too much. That is not how we've historically operated. It's just not what we do. Okay, I get that. But I will tell you the beauty that came out of this cohorting wasn't only that kids were healthier and staff were healthy, but kids, in essence, we gave them some boundaries, right? Of things they couldn't do. They couldn't maybe be in the same cabin with the best friend they've been with for the past 5 years. Maybe they were in a different cabin, right? Because there was an age difference or whatever. And they were, in essence, somewhat forced to make new friends. They were forced to make new relationships. They were forced to kind of do some of that. And the feedback when kids got home, we did some post-camp parental surveys. We looked at those, and the camp parents said, my kids said it was the best summer they've ever had at camp. They met a new friend this year. They developed a new family unit. Because they didn't mix as much as in previous years, many campers said it was the most rich, engaging, communicative experience they've had at camp. But some of that was because we initially caused some of those boundaries, right? And people said, you're going to make my kids stay with 10? Yep. If we're going to operate camp, that's what we're going to do. So that's typically what camps did, kept them in small groups. And when you do that, if you have someone who presents with illness symptoms, then it's very easy to do contact tracing and to separate that one group of the 10 out and let the other 9 groups, the other 90 kids, can continue camping and doing their regular activities. It doesn't impact your larger camp group. So I know initially people say, that's not how we operate. That's not our culture. I understand that. But I encourage you to think about maybe doing camp a little different this year. Try something new. We're really good at doing what we've always done, but COVID, if it's done nothing else, it's pushed us out of our comfort zone. It's made us try and do things in a different way. And just the beauty of what's come out of that has been absolutely fascinating to watch and see. Hand hygiene. I'm a nurse. I talk about these crazy things all the time, right? About hand washing, right? And historically, you sent the kids in, you went into the dining hall and you said, kids, go wash your hands in the bathroom. We want you to schedule hand hygiene as an activity on your schedule. We want somebody to go in the bathroom with them and sing the birthday song while they put soap on their hands. We want you to make it an activity as part of the experience, right? So think about, okay, I'm not just going to tell the kids, hey, kids, run in the dining hall bathroom and wash your hands. No, I'm going with them because I need to wash these things as well. We're going to sing the happy birthday song or whatever song you want to sing for 20 seconds. So we all lather up really well and just make it fun. It's easy to make hand washing fun, right? You can do soap and water, which is preferred, especially if your hands are obviously dirty, but you can also use sanitizer greater than 60% alcohol. Now, hear me when I tell you this. We are not good at using sanitizer as a good cleaning agent because we don't do the technique right. When we put soap and water on our hands, we do this and we do this, and the water and soap run all over our hands, right? We put hand sanitizer, we squirt a dollop in our hands and we rub our hands together, right? We do this. Guess what happens? The palms get cleaned, but these dirty little things never get cleaned. And these are the critical pieces. They're the things that touch our face. They're the things that take our mask off. They're the things that reach out and grab things on the dining hall table. They're the things that touch our peers, right? So when you do hand sanitizer, you literally have to teach people how to rub it all over the front and backs and get their fingers. Because you know how it is, you walk in the dining hall and somebody's standing there with a bottle and they squirt it all up in your hand and they do this, and then they're off to do what they're supposed to do. No, you really have to teach hand sanitizer. I know it sounds a little crazy, but just believe me, the evidence has shown that we're just not as good at hand sanitizer as we are at soap and water. And in essence, makes soap and water the better cleaner, if for no other reason than we do the technique much better. I've talked about ventilation, moving things outdoors, opening your windows, fans. We know it is a really critical NPI. So we encourage you to think about that at your camp. What can you do at your camp to increase ventilation, to increase air movement across buildings or structures so that you're not in any type of stagnant air location if possible? Sanitizing, I talked about that. Cleaning daily, cleaning your high touch areas. Face mask, we did talk about that. The thing we know about face mask is that we got concerned. We said kids can't keep their face mask on 24/7, 5 or 7 days of the week. No, they cannot. And that is not the expectation. And what we did find out last year is that camps did a really good job of being very intentional about when kids would have those face masks off, right? And when you added up all the times that the kids could have the face mask off, you'd be amazed how much time their face mask was off. They don't wear a mask when they eat. They don't wear a mask when they sleep. They don't wear a mask when they're doing any kind of water activity. They don't wear a mask when they're outdoors and 6 feet apart from others. And they don't even have to wear a mask when they're indoors and 6 feet apart if you have good ventilation. So you can think about, hey, if I don't want my kids to have to wear masks, we're going to go outside and throw frisbee or throw footballs or play games. The kids naturally spaced apart, take their mask off, and for many hours of the day, they're not, in essence, wearing a mask. Physical distancing, I told you, was the hardest thing. We knew it was going to be the hardest thing going into last summer. The key is that we didn't want counselors to become a distancing police, to walk around going, step away, don't get so close, don't do that. We didn't want that. So we really encouraged people last year to use a lot of visual reminders about distancing. So they did things like they bought a lot of duct tape and spray paint last year, but they spray painted circles in the grass where they wanted each of the cohorts to stay. So if they're doing a whole camp movie, right, then each cohort could be there together, but in their own circle, right, 6 feet away from maybe some of the other groups. If they want to do all camp things, they had to think about how they could do that with each cohort or family kind of as a separate unit. They also used a lot of duct tape to mark off areas where they didn't want people to sit. So if they have benches outside their dining hall, they might mark off the main seat, the seat in the middle, and just had people sit on each end of the bench. If there's seats in the dining hall, they marked those off with duct tape and said, don't walk in this area, right? So they used a lot of visual reminders so the counselors weren't walking around all the time policing the distancing. I had one camp who bought pool noodles that were 6 feet long and gave one to each kid as a gift. And the kids could then say, hey, if they're within my pool noodle distance, they're too close. And the kids loved it, right? It was a pool noodle. They swung it around. They played with them. They bonked each other, I'm sure, a few times for fun. But it was a great visual reminder so kids could go, oh, 6 feet. We do know that the schools, the CDC recommendation has now turned to 3-foot physical distancing in schools. We are waiting very patiently and for any day for CDC to give us our updated guidance for camps. But we think it might be something very similar. So again, that kind of alleviates some of that 6-foot radius piece. If we can say, we're looking at a 3-foot radius, which is about an arm's length, right? So an arm's length apart from each other. And that sometimes is a little more feasible. But we know physical distancing will continue to be probably the more challenging in PI. As you plan your NPIs for the summer, we're still in that step one of the CDP, right? Here's some of the things you want to think about in your structure. And I'll send this presentation to Kiefer or Bill, whoever wants it, and they'll share it with you. So you're going to have all this. You don't have to write it down. But when you think about, okay, we need to come up with a plan for our hand hygiene. In that plan, think about, where am I going to have hand washing stations? How am I going to have access to hand sanitizer? How frequently do I want the kids to wash their hands in the schedule, right? What we know why people use more hand sanitizer than they do hand washing is because access, right? Many people don't have access to hand washing stations at the fishing dock, or they have access to hand washing stations on the hiking trail, whatever that might be. But last year, the camps created activities and had kids build hand washing stations as an activity for their camp. Now, again, that was another beautiful outcome, because in making this building hand washing stations, it was an arts and crafts event. They could do something with wood and build and be constructive, but they were at the same time learning to give back to their community and to support and love others by creating access to hand washing. So camps did everything they could, and they built very cheap. They used spare parts at camps. They did all kinds of things to kind of make it happen, to have hand washing stations. There's even portable hand washing stations that require no electricity. You plug up the water hose. It has a foot pedal, and you pump it. And when the kids pump it with their foot, it makes the water come out. Soap and water hanging out there. It was really simple ways to do those things. Ventilation, same thing. Cohorts, kind of outline how you're going to organize your groups. How are those groups going to navigate the activities? Do you have a plan for how they're going to get from activity to activity? How might you do food service? Maybe you say, hey, everybody's going to have a picnic table outside, and each group is going to have their own picnic table, and this is where they'll eat every meal. Okay. Maybe they're picnicking on the ground. Maybe you're going for hikes and having picnics. I mean, you can do so many different things that just become part of the camp experience. When you're outlining face masks, think about who must wear them, when they must wear them, when they can be removed. What are you going to do if there's soiled or lost masks? So writing all that down on paper can be very helpful to everybody that's involved in this process of kind of doing these NPIs. The distancing, the physical distancing, and then of course the screening. When and how you're going to screen. You're going to do pre-screening, initial, and ongoing. What are those three components going to look like? Screening last year, some camps used a paper and pencil model where people filled it out every day. Some camps used an app. And there were several apps that are free, and they had the kids then fill in. They pulled up the app on their phone. They said, no fever, no cough, no illness, no. They took their temperature, they put it in the little app, and they hit the send button, and that data immediately came to camp that day, which is a very nice feature, right? Because you're not waiting till day 14 to see all of their screening information. It's very helpful if you can see screening information before they get to your door. Because if a parent is driven 2 hours or 3 hours to drop their kid off for camp, and you get at the screening form and you say, hey, wait a minute, 3 days ago, your kid had a little grade temp and a cough. I really need you to go get a COVID test. No parent's going to be happy about that. We know that. But for the safety of your community, you're almost required to do that, right? Because you have to think about the larger community. So if there's a way for you to gather that screening data ahead of time, and then every day you just scroll through there to see if anything raises a red flag, it's very easy to do it on an app type of mechanism. Okay, so let's talk about the key piece here. What if there's an outbreak, right? Oh my goodness, what are we going to do if there's an outbreak, right? The thing about outbreak management is that every camp has very different capacity. I have camps that I work with that serve 10,000 kids a year. I have camps I work with that serve 25 kids a year, right? Those capacities to manage different things and function are very different. And only you really know the capacity of your camps, right? So we talk about a COVID case. Anybody who presents with illness this summer, you're probably going to have your guard up, and probably anybody who has the illness symptom, you're going to consider COVID suspect, meaning this person maybe could have COVID. We don't know. They present with a low-grade fever. They present with a cough. They present with just fatigue and not feeling well. Any of those people could be COVID suspect. And this is where it's really important that you have someone who can do a really good assessment of the individual to make decisions. And one of the first decisions you have to make is this individual who presents in the health center have symptoms that are potentially communicable, mean transmissible between people, right? Or is this something that's non-communicable? And sometimes it's hard to tell. So the first person who presents is called your index case. And then people who present ill after that, of course, are subsequent cases. But those will all be people who have illness symptoms. So you have to decide, is this communicable or is it non-communicable? And sometimes only time will tell. So if I present and I feel fatigued and tired, maybe I have a headache, maybe I've just been out in the sun too long and I'm overheated and I need to rehydrate, right? So maybe you put them in a room, you let them rest, you give them water. If they feel better in 2 hours, it's not a communicable illness. They've been out in the sun too long, right? You've been playing long and hard. They're rehydrated. They feel really well. They won't feel better in that short period of time if they have a communicable illness. All right. So that's kind of one of those pieces of knowing, having someone who can ask the right questions, do good assessment, and then deciding what to do, how to manage that person. So we're going to leave the non-communicable in the gray at the bottom. It's pretty straightforward. If we think this is a potentially transmissible illness, then we have to put that person in isolation. Okay. Isolation can be a room in a health center. Isolation this past summer were for many camps, tents outdoors. So they put a tent up out somewhere that was kind of separate from everywhere else, had the sides open. So while the kid was in isolation, they were still using as many NPIs as possible. They're under a tent, they're in ventilation, they're physically distanced, they're using hand sanitizer, they're good hand washing, using sanitizer. They're doing all the NPIs they can while this kiddo's in isolation. Once they're in isolation, the decision then is, do I have the capacity to test them and keep them there? Is that what I will need to do? Or am I in a place in a location that I just call the parent and send them home? Every camp will have a different decision when you get to that point, right? So I present ill or with a cough, you're not sure what to do with me, you put me in isolation, all right? Bill, Tracey, and Kiefer are in the cabin with me, and they are now exposures. So that cohort, that family unit, has now got to go to quarantine. All right. Once you have the ill person in isolation and potentially exposed people in quarantine, you're going to treat them very similar about how you take care of them. Right. Some camps, again, may say, hey, no, if you present with the illness symptom, you're going home. But then you still have to decide what to do with those folks who are potentially exposed. If I go home and I get tested and I'm negative, then that quarantine group could be released back to doing their normal camp structure activity operation. If I am positive, those exposed folks have either got to stay in quarantine, right? Or they may be sent home depending on what your camp decides to do in that situation. All right. If you keep them on site, you have to think about things like, how do you get food to the ill people? What is your facilities support? Like, do you have bathrooms that are separate for them? How do you do water, garbage, laundry for the ill people? Do you have somebody who's your point of communications for families, for stakeholders, for board members, whoever that might be? And then for the person in isolation, you want to strengthen those MPIs. The minute you have somebody who presents COVID suspect, maybe even before testing, you want to go ahead and strengthen your NPIs for the camp. Many times people have been there 4 or 5 days and they're starting to feel comfortable and starting to get relaxed, and maybe we're not as quite as attuned to some of the NPIs and we're chilling a little bit. The minute you find, okay, we've got a person in isolation, strengthen those NPIs back up, right? Make sure we hold fast to that. I don't know how long most of your camps are, and I'm going to go with the assumption that most of them are about a week of camp, and then you have either new campers come in or whatever. In that period of time, we tell people, kind of treat everybody like they had COVID for the first 4 to 5 days. Just pretend like everybody has COVID. Do all of the good NPIs, get all the hand washing, and it's a much safer approach to go that way than to be too relaxed when they come in. And we're going to talk about COVID testing and vaccines here in a minute. So this just kind of gives you an algorithm. It's hard to put everything on one page because it gets too busy. If you have a quarantine group, the one thing I point out is that you can create what we call a shadow camp, meaning they can still do camp activities. They just can't be around the other groups, right? So the other people who are in my cabin who are now potentially exposed, they could go on a hike together still. They could do our Arts and Crafts project together. They can do things together, but they kind of do it over here in somewhat of a shadow camp experience, right? Off to by themselves in a different way. And that may mean they do lots of things in their cabin because nobody else is allowed in their cabin. That was another thing camps did last year. In your cabin groups or your family villages, nobody came into that sleeping quarters except the people living there, right? So it kind of kept all the other people outside of those sleeping quarters, which again created somewhat of a bubble within a bubble mechanism for protection. So let's talk about, so we've got the 7, right, that we know about, the 7 MPIs we've talked about thus far. This year, there's 2 additional MPIs. One is testing and one is vaccine. Testing is definitely one of those things you can think about. I know that many camps that are residential in particular, many day camps are not, but most residential camps are thinking about doing some type of testing. In the case of week-long camps, most of that is usually a test before they come to camp, usually 3 to 5 days before arrival on site. There's really 3 types of tests. In our particular case at camp, the antibody test is really not very helpful or effective, right? We're not going to be needing that in any particular way for the most part. The 2 types of tests that are important are the PCR and the antigen. And I'm just going to give you a really quick synopsis of how they work because I don't want to spend the whole hour talking about it. But PCR and antigen basically help detect, in essence, viral load in different ways, all right? Because one's a molecular test and one's a protein test. But what they're really doing is saying, hey, how sick is this individual? So what happens is if I'm exposed to someone with COVID, then what happens if I contract COVID, my viral load starts to rise, all right? At about day 4 to 5, my viral load is typically high enough to be detected on a test. If you test me too early, my viral load is too low and I'll look negative, all right? So my viral load comes up, it peaks, and then it starts back down after a period of time, right? So the window between here and here is when my viral load is high enough to be detected on a test. If you test me down here or down here, it's too low. So timing is everything when we talk about testing. Timing is critical when you talk about testing, all right? So people say, well, I'm just going to test them on day of arrival. All right, so really what you're saying when you test them on day of arrival is I'm really seeing, were they exposed 4 to 5 days ago, right? You could do that, but then you have the challenges of getting test results back and knowing kind of what to do with people when you're waiting for a test result. We'll talk a little more about that. There are different testing options now. Last summer, we didn't have testing. As a general rule, we just didn't have testing massively available. Your challenge this summer is you have too many choices to choose from. There are pages of companies doing COVID testing, PCR and antigen testing that you can choose from as a testing option. You can do testing like through a lab, meaning you can have people go to a lab and get tested, get your results. You can do a hybrid program of testing, meaning somebody at camp gathers a specimen, whether you're doing a nasal swab or a spit test. Somebody at camp gathers that specimen and sends it off for testing. Or you can do a full camp testing program where the test is done there at camp, processed at camp, and analyzed at camp. And again, this really depends on what your camp's capacity is to do that. Let me see. I think I want to, let me go. Okay. So the key for us, and the first question you have to decide about testing is, there are really 3 reasons we test, right? We test for screening. Remember the health awareness thing about screening? We're screening people for health awareness. Testing is another NPI to raise health awareness, to screen, to make sure people are arriving to camp in a healthy state. That's our language over and over again. We want people to arrive to camp in a healthy state. So we can do testing as a screening tool. We can also then do testing diagnostically, meaning I showed up in the health center, I have a cough or a fever, you want to test me to see if I have COVID. All right. Symptoms usually show up about day 4 to 5, right? So by the time I'm showing up with symptoms, I was probably exposed 4 or 5 days before that point. So you could test me to get a diagnosis, diagnostic testing. Mitigation testing is what we would do to the people who were potentially exposed. So let's say I show up, I've got symptoms, you're going to do diagnostic testing on me, all these guys who were in my group that were potentially exposed. From the moment I show up in the health center, depending on how long you're going to have your campers there, you would wait and test them 4 to 5 days later, right? Because if they've just been exposed to me today, 4 to 5 days, they could have been exposed to me earlier, but let's say they're exposed to me the day that I show symptoms. Then 5 days later, you test them approximately to see if their COVID test comes back positive, all right? The chance of that is very low. That risk is very low. I mean, you'd have to be up in people's faces for, remember what the diagnosis is of exposed, close proximity, extended period of time for 15 minutes, right? And with the potential of sharing respiratory secretions. Now that we're all wearing masks, that risk goes down significantly. So I mentioned to you that the challenge is you have so many tests to choose from. So if you're going, yes, Tracey, we want to test, I think that's a good decision. Testing is important. Testing is something you can have your families do before they get to camp. And that's probably, if you're a 1-week camp, the best option to go. This is a website by Harvard. We started trying to put together our own list of COVID tests, and then we started that and we got way in deep to realize there's so many tests out there. It's crazy. But Harvard created this beautiful website, and I can't show it all to you here. It's like 4 pages. But the first part of this website is they outline for you the nucleic acid test, which is a PCR, and the protein test, which are antigen tests. And they kind of tell you a little bit about them. I promise you this document is dense, so don't get overwhelmed when you go there, right? But it does try to give you everything about symptoms, testing, timing of testing. But on the last 3 pages, on page 2 and page 3, is the list of approved PCR tests through the FDA. So you're probably going to be approached by a company that says, hey, let us do your COVID testing. Hey, we got COVID testing available for you. You got to know what questions to ask, right? So what we're telling camps to do is go to this website. Harvard has done a lot of that work for you to say, is this an approved test from the FDA? And you can find it sometimes by the test name or the company name. They're both there because the company name doesn't always match up with the test product they're trying to sell. And then on the very last page are all the antigen tests that are approved. All right. So this is a really nice document in that it gives you ideas about what's approved, and it also outlines for you the 2 things you want to know about a test. Now, timing, as I told you, is hugely important, but more important than that is what is the sensitivity and specificity of that test. That means we're looking to see how frequently does that test give false negative results, meaning it gave you a negative result, but the person's actually positive. And how many times does that test give you a false positive result, meaning it's showing positive, but actually the person's negative. All right. So that's what sensitivity and specificity mean. And that's listed in this chart. So if you go and you say, okay, I want to look up the Bionex test, it'll give you the sensitivity and specificity for almost all these tests. Now, some of those lines are blank, so that should raise your red flag if they don't give you some sensitivity and specificity information. But these tests have to have that data to get FDA approval. Now, when I say FDA approval, I mean through emergency use authorization. So it'll say FDA, EUA out beside each of the tests, because all these are authorized under emergency use authorization, similar to how the vaccines have come onto market. All right. Choosing a test is challenging, but I can tell you that having your people go to a lab of some kind, getting a PCR test, which is still the gold standard, is probably your best choice for week-long camp experiences. That way, when they show up to you, they've been pre-screening for 10 to 12 days. They've been becoming self-aware of their health status. They show up with a negative PCR, and now you're launching into doing all of your NPIs at camp. This is a table we created, and again, this is for your use because we had camps saying we just don't know. We don't know how to use a test. So these are the different types of camp: day, residential, rental, family. We think most camps will fall into one of these 5 groups pretty closely. And if you're a residential camp and you're 7 days or less, your staff is there for the full season, whatever your full season might be. Maybe that's 7 days as well. Then you want to do a 14-day pre-screen is what we want you to consider. Please note the title of this form. This does not say this is regulation or requirement. These are potential testing patterns for consideration. From all the evidence and data we've been working on over the year, these are the things right now that we think are the best options or considerations for you as a camp. So if you're in this residential category here, and we can pick any of them, then on testing pre-camp for campers and staff, a PCR antigen test before arrival, right? If you don't want to do that, you can say or PCR antigen test 5 days after arrival, right? On arrival, after arrival. So want to think about testing timing is hugely important, right? If you're testing them 3 to 5 days before they arrive, it does no good to test them again on arrival day because that's typically within less than a 5-day window. Does that make sense? So it's not even if they've been exposed. If they get a PCR test on a Wednesday, all right, let's say a Wednesday, and they're coming to camp to you on Saturday, they're negative. You know, as of Wednesday, they were negative. They don't have COVID. So the only risk days are Thursday and Friday, and they're coming to you on Saturday, right? So they're traveled, so that hopefully they stay home between the time they take their test on Thursday and Friday. Their exposure risk is travel on Saturday. So testing them again just 3 days later is not enough time for that viral load typically to rise high enough to give you a good test result. If you wanted to test again, you would want to wait at least 5 days, right? So instead of trying to track everybody in their individual test, you'd say, well, we're going to test them before they come to camp and then wait about 4 to 5 days into camp and retest everybody again, if that's what you want to do. Again, week-long camps usually test before, and then they don't test again unless they need to do it diagnostically. What? Meaning someone showed up with illness symptoms. They would test them diagnostically. Here's the test we would recommend if you develop symptoms. Remember, this is a diagnostic test. Here's what we would recommend. And then if people were exposed, right, you have to follow the guidance of your public health department in your state. And some states have very different guidance, Colorado being one of them. But other states say use whatever you think is appropriate, right? So just know that these are some of the recommendations. These are why we're recommending certain things. Quarantine, if it's a camper and they're there less than 7 days, you're not going to test them till they return home and they were exposed. If it's a staff, you can do a PCR antigen test 4 to 5 days post-exposure, especially if they're going to be there multiple weeks, right? So it's a lot of information. I'm getting you down in the weeds, but I'm hopeful that you look at this and go, okay, we got to test them for screening. And depending on how long we're at camp, we may or may not decide to retest them. Unless they develop symptoms, we would do a diagnostic test maybe. Vaccines. All right. So vaccines, we know there's 3 available now, Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. We know that millions of people are being vaccinated, but we still know that these vaccines are not truly FDA approved. They're still under EUA authorization. So we know that with every vaccine that's given, those manufacturers are still required to collect data, to check for side effects, to check for adverse events, to see how people do with the vaccine. So I'm fully vaccinated. I'm hoping many people are getting fully vaccinated. And we hope that most all of your staff will be fully vaccinated. If you've been following the ACA guidance, you will know that they've worked diligently to get camp staff moved to a higher level of vaccine status, to move them up to the 1C category in most states, where they can get vaccinated with child care workers and child care providers and after school and teachers, all those people working with children. Because historically they would be down in that younger age range and have to wait longer to get their vaccine. So as a camp counselor, ACA has been working hard to get them moved up into that 1C category. And most states have acquiesced to that. They're fine with that, to get your staff vaccinated early. We encourage you to have your staff vaccinated. We encourage you to really help them understand the value of vaccination. If you know it's important that vaccine creates what we call herd immunity, and my friend Dr. Blaisdell calls it community immunity, because in essence we're creating immunity for our community, our camp community. If your staff are vaccinated, it does alleviate a lot of challenges at camp. One of the biggest challenges last year at camp were staff. All right, were staff. Staff had to be completely bought in 110% last year because we didn't have vaccines, we didn't have testing, right? So if someone became ill, that camp had to have a really firm line policy about you're going home or you're going to be in isolation for 2 weeks or whatever that was going to be. But this year with vaccines and testing, it really changes the game quite a bit. With your staff, the thing we know is that staff want to interact with one another when they're off. So if they're parsed out into the different family units and you have 2 counselors with each family unit, those counselors in some point really do want to interact. If they have some time off, if there's a staff area they can hang out, they're going to want to interact. And having them vaccinated is the most liberating way for them to interact with one another. I'm going to share some CDC guidance with you that was just released it's now April, right? It was released in March. That kind of is changing some of the dynamic for vaccinated staff. We think the mandating of vaccine is a little bit of a gray area. We're not sure that we feel that you can confidently do that wholeheartedly, but I know there are camps who really do want to do that. And there's other camps who say we're not there yet. So we have people across the board around this mandating of the vaccine, especially since it's not officially FDA approved. And then of course I just put this immunization policy questionnaire for it to kind of be on your radar. You know what your immunization policy is for your camp, and therefore you can kind of make decisions or kind of have that in the back of your mind as it comes to vaccination of staff for COVID. This is the CDC guidance that was released March the 8th. Vaccinated people may visit with other fully vaccinated people indoors without wearing masks or staying 6 feet apart. That is great news. All right. And I'm hopeful that this is kind of guidance for congregate settings. They don't really say guidance for camp, but this is for people who are going to be in kind of different areas and different groups. So if your staff are all vaccinated, okay, they can come together, they can take their mask off, they can interact with one another, and then go back to their cohorts. And they feel like that's a reasonably safe process to do that. We don't have guidance about what you do with unvaccinated staff. So let's say you have 20 staff there, 18 are vaccinated and 2 are not. Right now, there is not guidance that says the unvaccinated can mix with the vaccinated, right? So you have to think about what you might do with those staff who are unvaccinated. And hopefully that might be incentive for them to get vaccinated so they can begin to be part of that staff community as well. The other guidance talked about they can refrain from quarantine and testing if they do not have symptoms of COVID-19 after contact with someone who has COVID-19. So if I'm a vaccinated staff and I, again, am exposed to someone with COVID-19, the new current guidance is I don't have to quarantine or be tested because I'm vaccinated. But the key is, if you think about that at camp, if I'm a staff member and I'm vaccinated, a kid presents with illness symptoms, so I'm potentially exposed, I may not, in essence, have to quarantine, but really you need to quarantine because you got to have staff with those kids anyway. Does that make sense? It's kind of a catch-22 because somebody's got to hang out with the kids that are in quarantine, so might as well be the staff who's already been with them. So because of the nature of camp and how we kind of operate, they don't have to quarantine right now related to CDC guidance, but you got to have somebody providing oversight of the kids that are in the shadow camp maybe. So just food for thought around that. As I mentioned, last year the biggest challenge was staff. We had staff who had anxiety around COVID concerns. We had staff who left early because somebody developed illness symptoms. A lot of different little scenarios were shared where they had to kind of talk staff down off the ledge a little bit because they were very anxious and nervous about somebody who either presented with COVID symptoms or who had potentially been exposed to COVID before they got to camp. So we really talked a lot about it. And at the National ACA conference, I presented a session with Dr. Ambrose on staff mesh support. And what can you do at camp that really doesn't cost you any money? It doesn't cost you too much time, but you do have to be kind of proactive. So knowing your staff and understanding how they regenerate and rejuvenate and rest is really important, especially if you're going to be with them for any kind of extended period of time. And these were all recommendations that came out of the chat box at the national conference event. The staff put in there, the people in the session put in the chat box, what do you do at camp to help your staff rejuvenate, right? Some camps said we give them opportunities to do physical things, like there's a space to do yoga, or we show them where the running trail is, or we offer opportunities to hike. We allow them to do personal time in some of the activities without kids, right? Some said we let them have a little time just do mental play. Check out, they do reading, they can do technology, check on their computer, play board games. So they just need some time to check out from their kiddo responsibilities and just kind of have some mental time, mental downtime. Therapy was a huge piece, how giving them time to connect with the other staff or connect with pets. We talked a lot about pet therapy, believe it or not. So if there are animals, we know animals are therapeutic for everybody. So if there's a way to have that option, that's great. Making resources available to people. Sometimes if someone is having anxiety or lives with anxiety or depression, they may or may not want to disclose that at camp. And so we tell people, find a place where you can just put up on the wall the resource number to behavioral health support. If they don't want to talk about it, here's the phone number you can call. Here's the contact you can make. Or here's the person on camp who can assist you. And that way, the individual who may be seeking some help privately can go to that resource on their own accord. And then, of course, best behaviors came up. Make sure we're always self-evaluating, making sure our behavior is appropriate, that we're validating one another, that we're listening and learning from staff in advance. I guess I can't reinforce enough the proactiveness of what we do. What we're doing now to prepare is hugely important. The more proactive you are now, you're going to ward off all kinds of issues that you have to react to once people get to camp. So we just don't want that. But this is just an infographic. You can find it on our website. You can use it anywhere you want to. You can post it in the staff area. You can think about each of these things and ways that you can do it. I don't think any of these, in essence, cost money, but they do require conscious, proactive effort for you to think about, okay, we have a couple hammocks. We can hang them in trees. And we have a really cool hiking trail. Let's make a map for people so if they want to go hike on their afternoon off, right? Just thinking about them so that you can hand those resources to people when they come to camp. If you haven't seen it, hopefully you have. This is the field guide. This is the document that we worked on with EH&E, Environmental Health and Engineering, ACA, ACN, EH&E. And we created all of these chapters. They basically launch into all of the NPIs, right? From food service to cleaning to activities to protective equipment, supplies, vaccines is on here, medical testing is on here. We're getting ready to do another update of the field guide. Probably we're waiting right now for CDC to drop their new guidance for us to have. But we're hopeful to kind of get a new updated field guide out, and I say next week. I'm very hopeful. I'm an eternal optimist, so there you go. So we'll see, but we're constantly updating the field guide. If you looked at this last fall, when you go back and look at it now, it's going to look very different. There's going to be updates in almost every area. You can find this on the ACA website. You can also find it on the ACN website, which is campnurse.org. So we keep an updated copy on our website, and ACA keeps an updated copy on their website. They're exactly alike. You can go to either place and get information. It is a living document. It's constantly being updated for your benefit. These are some other resources. Again, these are living resources, meaning they're constantly changing. So if you read them last fall, they're different. Uh, I was making a recommendation a few weeks ago to a group, and then they said, we can't find it on the CDC website. And lo and behold, it had been updated, and I had not captured the new update. So I'm constantly reading CDC and constantly reading as many different resources and what the current recommendations are. Um, we send stuff to the CDC, they send stuff back, and what ends up coming out of that may be very similar to what we send or recommend, or it may look quite different. So we never really know kind of what that final drop of information is going to look like. So these are the places you can go. These are information sources. Our website, ACA's website. We have a whole COVID page on our website with tons of stuff there related to health services and wellness, screening tools and templates. So always trying to make sure it is accessible to all of you. And these are just some things that are coming up. Remember we talked about the staff mental, emotional, social health. We call that MESH was an issue. So Mr. John Hamilton, he's with Alliance for Hope, and they do lots of work around mental, emotional, social health and the concept of hope. He runs camps for kids from abused homes. And so he has a robust message around hope-centered care, and it's just a really beautiful way to kind of think about how we talk and walk through the mental, emotional, social health of our campers and staff. Then we're doing a medication management and COVID webinar on the 14th of May. So we have those two coming up. You're welcome to join us. We'd love to have you. Historically in the health center, medications may have been managed one way 2 years ago in 2019. And we have really, in ways, adjusted that because we don't want people congregating in the health center. We want them out and about. So the health staff are now taking medications out to the cohorts or to the family units, or they're taking them out to where they're having their picnic meals. So we're not wanting people to congregate in areas. Walk away thinking these things. You have 9 NPIs now, 9. Use as many NPIs as you can for every single thing you do at camp. So as you walk through your camp schedule, and you say, okay, we have archery. How many NPIs can I use at archery? I can do ventilation, it's outdoors. We can sanitize the equipment. We can do hand washing when people walk up. We can do physical distancing, keeping people separate. How many NPIs can you do in every single event? How many NPIs can you use in food service? How many NPIs can you use for sleeping people in the cabins? What can you do there to use as many NPIs as possible? Can we get our staff vaccinated? Or what's our testing protocol going to look like? I want to say to you more than anything, you can do this. It's not rocket science. It is just some really good proactive work right now. Camps are walking away going, yeah, I think I can do this. We've got this. I know you got this. I know you can do it. Full faith. Our hotline is always open and available all summer long. You don't have to be an ACN member, but you can call us anytime in the summer and say, okay, I need to double check this. I need another person to give me their feedback on a particular situation. And we're glad to do that for you. This number at the top of the screen is our hotline number. That's also our website up there, and that's also the way you can email us, acn@campnurse.org. I do a lot of work through email with people. Every night I'm responding to emails and questions and needs for information and documents. So we are trying to be very attentive and stay up to date with all those requests and needs for different groups. All right. I got done. 5:10 is what I have. Let me stop sharing. And let's see if there's any questions.
We do have a number of questions. Okay. I'll kind of get them chronologically as they had come through. From Tim back at 2:30 had said, an outbreak with COVID would be an outbreak among staff primarily, right? Because by the time a person becomes symptomatic, it would be anywhere from 5 to 14 days from contact. So really an outbreak would look more like contract tracing and public relations. And I believe that you primarily answered most of that already.
Okay, yeah. So most of the time if we are gonna, it doesn't have to be staff. It could be kids. We know historically that in COVID in kids has been very mild, or like we didn't even know they had COVID, right? And so we have there's been different reports about whether they're super spreaders or not. Some people say no, some people say, yeah, we think so. So when you start looking at German reports and Italian reports and American reports, there's some real not clear guidance around if kids are really super spreaders or not. But in essence, they don't become ill for the most part. And so it is hard to kind of, even at camp, for the most part, if a child does have COVID, you may or may not know it, right? And if you're only a 1-week camp, they're going to be gone home before you ever know that they've exposed others in essence.
All right, great. The next 2 questions came from Brian. The first was, how do we, or do we have to discriminate those who conscientiously choose not to be vaccinated, as in not hire, or I'm thinking even in rules for vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and how might this work?
Yeah, that is a tough question. And we don't look at this as discrimination. The way we explain this to folks is that you, as a camp director, camp leader, whatever your title might be, you have a responsibility for the health and wellness of the camp community as a whole. So yes, we care about each individual within that camp, but in essence, what some camps are saying is we're probably going to have a preference for staff that are vaccinated for the health and wellness of our camp community. That's their language. We're probably going to have a preference for staff who are vaccinated for the health and wellness of our camp community. We love you. We care about you. We totally understand if you don't want to take the vaccine, but this is kind of what our responsibility is as leaders of this particular community to make sure we provide the best safety measures that we can. So it's not discriminating. It's just saying we have to think about the larger context of the group.
Great. And then Brian had also asked if you have any resources for Canada or know of any recommendations of resources for Canada.
For vaccine or testing or a lot of the Canadian province. So like we work closely with the Canadian Camp Nurses Association and their group and the Ontario group as well. They tend to rely on what we put out. So a lot of those nurses there are members of our association, and then they take our documents and translate it to their provinces of their provinces. I don't know if the Canadian government is putting what they're putting out. So no, I don't track that in particular, but I could reach out to some of our Canadian nurses and see if they have any information they could share. I'll be glad to do that.
All right, and Heather had asked where we can get a copy of this presentation. Heather, this will be available on our website, adventistcamps.org, probably within a week, maybe a week and a half. It kind of depends on how the tech team can get it processed. Another question that came in from email actually says, there are so many places giving recommendations for summer camps. How do we choose which ones to follow? For example, federal and CDC and even the POTUS seems to be saying, don't leave your house. And then other places are saying, take some precautions, but you'll be fine. How do we know what the official word is and what to really trust?
So we work hand in hand with the CDC on putting out our guidance. So the thing I say is that the CDC, ACA, ACN walk hand in hand with the same guidance. We don't put out different guidance from the CDC. We follow right in line, and we make recommendations to them for our communities, and then they feed us back kind of recommendations with their larger model of evidence they have available to them. So CDC, ACA, and ACN are all on the same page with our recommendations. Now the key is that yes, you're getting a lot of different information, but the ones that are constantly being updated are the ones you want to follow, right? So if you're reading evidence from April, May, June of last year, it's like reading evidence from 10 years ago, right? Don't go there. You need to read the evidence from December, January, February, right? Because we're putting out evidence so fast and so quickly. I literally just completed COVID health history addendums. I got it done Sunday night, right? Came home from church. I was like, I got to get this out because many people were asking. They wanted some type of what kind of COVID questions do we add to our health history form, right? So jumped on Zoom, worked on this, got this document finalized, and we're putting that out. So as quickly as we get that information and put it out, I encourage you, if you're an accredited camp, you're going to get the best information. If you're a member of ACN, we provide all of the health and wellness information for camps. We're the ones that put most of the health and wellness information on the ACA website as well. So what you're seeing from a health and wellness perspective, we feed them much of that. Like I've sent my COVID addendum forms to ACA because to me, it's more important that people have access to the information. That way camp directors often get the access through ACA. We have camp directors as members as well. And healthcare staff and people are getting access through ACN. But it's all available. It's all public knowledge on both of those websites. If you're going to ACA and ACN, looking at the field guide, you're getting the most current information out there. So I would follow the CDC guidance. Of course, I'm a nurse. I'm a nurse scientist. So I'm going to follow the evidence and let the good Lord take it from there.
All right, another question here. What is known about summer camp 2020 COVID cases and experience for those who had campers? Do you have any key points of maybe things that those who operated in 2020 said, oh, we're going to do this differently?
Oh my goodness. I could spend another hour on this. So some of the things we talk about are some of the creative strategies that camps did last summer to use their NPIs, right? And I kind of mentioned they built hand washing stations as an activity instead of just trying to make that available. Last summer, most all the camps did drive-through check-in, all right? So parents did not come onto the campsite. They set up some orange cones. The parent drove in with the kid to the camp. They rolled the window down. They took the child's temperature through the window. They asked them their COVID questions. Have you had this, or this? If everything was negative, the kid got out of the car, handed their medications off to the designated person, and walked into camp. Parents never entered their campsite. Now, I will tell you, healthcare staff loved it. Instead of spending 4, 5, 6 hours trying to talk to parents, trying to walk through everything, they had got it done in 45 minutes. And these were people that are processing in several hundred kids to get into camp. And they'd be done. We're like, we were done in an hour and a half. Boom, temperature, any of these symptoms, out the door, drop the meds. They were gone. And so they said, we're keeping that. We're going to keep the drive-through check-in. But that did mean that those camps had to be more proactive, right? They had to, the week before camp, call the families and say, look, our policy is that nobody will be allowed on camp except the campers. So we just need to walk through and make sure everything you submitted on your application 3 months ago is still current. Make sure that all the medications the kiddos bring into camp match up with this application and is current. And they would do that. They updated the forms, whether electronic or in paper. And then when the kid arrived, they had the most current information. And if they brought something that didn't match what was on the form, the kiddo didn't get it, or they made the phone call or whatever. But it really was just kind of update your health form to make sure it matches where they were 3 months ago, make sure there's not anything new that happened, check their medications, and then when they pulled in, they just drove through. And literally it was just almost a nonstop slow ebb through camp and back out. But people really liked it. It gave them more time on opening day. They didn't feel like they spent the entire opening day just getting people processed in. So that was another great thing. Another thing is that they took all their health services outdoors. So many camps weren't in their health centers this year. They popped a tent up outside. The nurses put a couple picnic tables out underneath the tent, and that was the health center. They gave meds. They triaged injuries there. They did nebulizer treatments there. They did everything outside. Why? They were trying to use as many NPIs as possible, right? They had the picnic tables spaced apart. They had ventilation. They washed their hands. They sanitized the tables. They were screened, right? So all the things they could do to introduce NPIs. And the nurses and healthcare people said, we loved it. We felt part of the camp community. We could see what was going on. The kids would come up and just connect with us, even though it wasn't a major ordeal. We were kind of felt part of the group. Historically, many of them have sat in the health center and waited for someone to come in, right? No fun. And sometimes it just takes kind of pushing people. I'm a little bit of a push people out of their comfort zones and see what happens, because we grow in our discomfort, in our uncomfortable situations sometimes. And so I'm like, yeah, go out underneath the tent. It's fine. No kid cares if another kid watches if their band get put on, or if they have to take a pill or two, or whatever that is. And then some of them had their health center tent, and then over here, a stone's throw away was their isolation tent. And the kids that were isolating were over here, they could see them. They didn't have to stay right with them. They bring them a stack or drinks, and they would kick back in the, in a lawn chair and reading a book or watching a movie, whatever, right? So they really just got creative in simple ways that entertained the kiddo, but the kid could still see what was going on camp. Friends could still yell up and talk to them. They just couldn't come within 6 feet of them. So there were just so many cool and creative things like that that happened last year. Many of those outdoor health services, picnic tables for eating, taking healthcare services out to the camp. So if a kid had an injury at the fishing dock, the kid didn't leave the activity and come to the health center. They called the health center. The nurses grabbed their to-go bag, they jumped in the golf cart, and off they went to the fishing dock or the horse barn or the archery or the whatever activity they were going to, right? And it allowed the cohort to stay together, the small group to stay together, not have to try to prevent mixing with others, but it allowed the nurses to get out and be part of that experience as well. So we got a lot of information about how this really changed the dynamic of what we do in health services, right? Giving medications out on camp and not in the health center. It's a good change. It's a really good change. It grows that community feel for everyone. So now I don't even know if I answered your question, Kiefer.
I think you hit some great points. So thank you. I think there were 3 other questions that came in on email, and those I believe we covered pretty in depth in terms of vaccinations, testing, isolation, and quarantine. So that's great. Heather has asked another question in the chat here. We probably have time for this one and one more if there's another out there. Any ideas for moving things outdoors as much as possible when we're in a climate where we worry about kids getting heat stroke due to temperature and humidity? And I know you mentioned early on that Texas camps were successful with this. How were they successful in that?
Lots of water activities. So, cool towels, popsicles in the coolers. They filled the coolers with ice, stuck those little popsicles down in there. The ones that are in the little plastic sleeves. Did lots of simple things. I mean, y'all think I'm crazy, but they did like sprinklers and kids running through the sprinkler, right? They loved it. Kids loved it. They didn't have to wear a mask. They were doing a water activity. They were outdoors. They were eating popsicles, hanging out on the picnic bench. I mean, just some really simple things. What happened last year was that many camps who have some pretty high level activity structures didn't use those. So for example, some camps were concerned about their high ropes course, right? They said, how do we clean it? We don't know. And we didn't know for sure. So what they did, they didn't use their high ropes course last year. What did they do? They threw balls and played in water activities and had water gun fights. And I mean, they went old school. They truly went old school, went back to 101 camping, what many of us did as kids before we got more of the high-tech savvy kind of camp activities. Kids didn't care. They just did not care. They are so excited to be with their friends. They're so excited to be at camp. They really reinforced the value of what we do at camp, right? Our mission for all of us at camp, connecting kids to one another, connecting kids to nature. We want to do those things because we think those are kind of really 2 deficits, if you will, and that our kids don't know how to have a conversation with each other. Some of our kids have never been out in, quote, nature, right? I've had kids come to camp and they go, I've never seen a cow. I'm like, you what? I'm in Kentucky, right? You've never seen a cow. I mean, really very different, culturally different upbringing. So it's just really cool to see kids be so inspired by some of the simplest things. So when you think you got to have some kind of big fancy program, I promise you do not. I promise you just have to have a willingness to kind of hang out with kids, play in the water hose and have some fun. But anytime you do water activities, be outdoors, intersperse that with other things. But yeah, they did a lot of water work this past summer.
Fantastic. Thank you for those ideas. I'm seeing in the chat, people are really responding well. This has been just a wealth of knowledge that you've shared with us.
Sure.
Last question here. Is it necessary to increase the number of nurse staff when bringing meds to the children?
So we're going to get into scope of practice here a little bit. So nurses have a scope of practice, and it can be a little different in each state. So no matter wherever you practice, the nurse, your nurse at camp needs to know her scope of practice. But in most every state, a nurse has the ability to delegate tasks to other individuals. They can't delegate decision making, but they can delegate tasks. So here, let me give you an example. If I'm the nurse and I'm at camp and I've got a pretty large population of campers, but I don't have any help, I can ask Bill to be my health assistant, even though he's not licensed, and I can teach Bill how to take a blood pressure or a temperature or give a pill. It's a task, but Bill is not responsible for the outcome of that. So if we drop a pill in the grass and we lose it, or we give the wrong medication to the patient, that comes back to the nurse, right? But the nurse has the ability to delegate and have assistance. It doesn't always have to be another nurse. If you have another nurse, that's great, but we know how hard nurses are to find. I totally get that. But it's called a UAP. You can delegate tasks to an unlicensed assistive personnel. And that is pretty common throughout scope of practice for nurses across the states. Some states will have a little difference, but for the most part, they can do that. So we encourage people, have a couple UAPs in your health center who can help do simple things. Like, they can't assess a wound, but if I tell them to go put a Band-Aid on, they can do that. They can put a Band-Aid on somebody. They can give a pill to somebody. They may not even know what the pill is, but I teach them. You go up to the camper, you ask them their name, you ask them their birthday to make sure it is the right person, right? So my responsibility to teach them everything they need to do as the nurse, and then they physically carry out the task. Now, if Bill takes a blood pressure for me, he brings those numbers back to me. I interpret the numbers and make a decision based on what that blood pressure is, right? That is not his responsibility, or he's not responsible for that. I am, as the licensed healthcare provider. So you absolutely can have another nurse, but there are other ways to gain help and assistance from people that you have trained. And we just like you would in a hospital, have a little orientation sheet, write down everything you've trained them to do, have them sign it, you sign it as the nurse, and then you've oriented this person to do this task.
Those are great ideas. Thanks for sharing. I'm sure a lot of that's helpful as we look to balance the workload with the few, trained and licensed nurses that we bring on. So there
are 5 things that every health center does: screening, medication management, communicable disease planning, delegation, and documentation. Every health center at every camp does those 5 things in some capacity. We have those 5 practice guidelines free for the taking on our website. You can go print them off. They're right there for you. And they will walk you through how to do that and the things you need to think about for your camp site, your camp facility. So there's a delegation one that walks you through how to delegate to someone using a procedure so that you have good understanding. It is important to write those things down, right? What should you be documenting? That's in our documentation practice guideline. What should you be documenting at camp? Of course, we all know we need to document care, but things like orientation of someone who's helping you, you absolutely need to document that as well.